The station's secondary communications deck intercepted the open-loop transmission from the human vessel at exactly noon. It was a 41-line uncompressed manifest listing structural tolerances for planetary surface saturation weapons, broadcast openly as a standard multi-species transparency protocol. In that exact second, 40 years of bureaucratic dominance inside the council chamber completely evaporated. High Counselor Robin stared at the scrolling data rows on his terminal, his long digits freezing over the interface. The text was entirely unencrypted, written in plain technical parameters that required no translation algorithm to decode. The air inside the lower deck smelled of stale nitrogen and the metallic tang of overheating cooling fins. A small green light on the edge of Robin's console flickered 3 times out of sequence, a tiny error in the power routing that nobody had fixed in 7 months. It was a dull, ordinary malfunction. Yet beneath it, the incoming data stream continued to populate the screen, steady and unhurried. The document did not contain threats, warnings, or diplomatic preambles. It merely listed kinetic yield limits, heat dispersal coefficients, and orbital bombardment grids for an unclassified deployment. The file had been classified for 112 years by the system that generated it. The title at the top of the transmission read clearly, Project Titan Strategic Platform Manifest. For more than a century, the human administration had logged every bolt, every reactor core, and every yield metric in public archives, while the 11-fold Galactic Directorate argued over sector boundaries. The consequence of that total disclosure was now parked on the outer edge of the system. The ship did not hide its weight. The initial sensor sweep registered a mass displacement that defied standard civilizational classification. The numbers did not waver or cycle through error loops. They remained flat, heavy, and absolute on the terminal display. Robin leaned forward, his slate-colored skin folding tightly around his collar. He did not call for an emergency session, nor did he alert the security details in the upper tiers. He simply watched the 41st line of the manifest finish its transmission. The loop closed, paused for 1 second, and began to broadcast the entire document again from the beginning. Would you have stayed in that room? Or would you have run before the realization hit the floor? Because the woman who sent that file did not run. The complaint had been sitting on the council's table for 11 days before anyone agreed on the wording. The directorate handled colonial disputes with a slow, deliberate rhythm that ground down small species before they ever reached a hearing. The outer expansion belt had always been handled this way. It was an empty corridor of cold rock and dust, valuable only to those who needed to hide from tax registries or maritime patrols. "We are 3 hours behind schedule," Sensor Officer Pell said, his hand rubbing a smudge from his primary optic lens. He did not look at Robin. "The mercantile delegates are already refusing to check the boundary markers until the morning shift." "Let them refuse," Robin said. His voice was flat, carrying the exhaustion of a senior administrator who had spent 4 decades watching the same arguments repeat. "The human representative has already crossed the outer marker. They will be at berth 7 within the hour." In his 40 years of council work, Robin had learned that species who replied quickly and politely were either very confident or very dangerous. The United Human Commonwealth had done both. When the formal notice regarding unauthorized mining stations was sent, their central office did not ask for a 3-month extension. They did not hire legal firms from the core worlds to contest the wording of the treaty. They sent a 6-word confirmation note, signed by a low-level clerk, stating that an envoy was en route. The station itself felt small today. Meridian was an old hub, built from heavy iron plates and anchored to a dead asteroid. It lacked the polished marble of the inner-world tribunals, its corridors filled instead with the steady thrum of air scrubbers and the smell of fuel oil. It was a place designed to process freight, not to host the turning point of a sector's history. "The mass reading is changing," Pell said, his fingers tapping a rhythmic sequence into the sensor board. He stopped, cleared the screen, and ran the diagnostic routine twice. The entry profile is incorrect. The system is filtering it as a stellar anomaly. Reset the array, Robin said. I did reset it. The mass is still there. Pell turned his head, his deep blinking pattern slowing to a halt. It displaces the equivalent of a small moon, a Class 4 gravitational body. It is 4.8 kilometers from bow to stern. The chamber doors opened 40 minutes later without a chime or an announcement. Ambassador Dara Vass walked into the room alone. She did not bring a staff of legal aides. She carried no data crates of historical land deeds, and she did not wear the heavy ceremonial silks common among the core world envoys. Her suit was a matte gray wool blend, completely unadorned except for a small bronze crest pinned to her left lapel. Her hair was dark, streaked with sharp lines of gray at the temples, and her expression was entirely blank. "High Counselor," she said, her voice matching the quiet efficiency of her stride. She took her place at the far end of the long mahogany bench, setting a thin leather briefcase on the polished wood. "I believe we have an appointment regarding the outer belt coordinates." Robin adjusted his robes, the heavy velvet sliding against the plastic chair. "We do, Ambassador, though our sensor logs suggest you brought more than a standard diplomatic party to the table. The enduring resolve is parked at a distance of 200 kilometers, Vass said, her fingers resting lightly on the brass clasp of her briefcase. She did not open it. "We chose that coordinate to ensure our drive core did not disrupt your local commuter traffic lanes. The civilian transport schedules seemed quite dense this morning." A short, sharp sound came from the side seats. Delegate Heth, the red-shelled representative of the mercantile syndicates, leaned forward until his carapace clicked against the table. 200 kilometers is within our sovereign defense perimeter, human. You brought a fortress into a peace negotiation." "We brought an escort," Vass said. Her tone remained perfectly courteous, devoid of any defensive edge. "Under the Commonwealth Civilizational Code, all Class 1 envoys travel with their standard baseline protection. It is an administrative requirement, not a tactical deployment." "A 4-kilometer platform is not a baseline," Heth said, his shell darkening with rising blood pressure. "It violates 3 separate articles of the Common Space Accords. The mass allocation alone requires a full council vote." Vass looked at him, her eyes steady and clear. "The Common Space Accords were signed in the year 2271. Is that correct, Counselor?" Robin nodded slowly. "The treaty has stood for nearly a century." "Humanity had not yet reached the atomic threshold for faster-than-light travel in 2271, Vass said. She reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate and smooth, and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was a stark contrast to the glowing data pads that littered the rest of the table. "We were not invited to the signing. We did not provide our seal to the articles. You cannot legislate our behavior through an institution we do not belong to." The room grew very quiet. The air scrubbers on the ceiling continued their low, rhythmic drone, shifting the scent of mineral oil across the delegates. Robin looked down at his own screen. The open-source manifest was still looping in the background, a silent line of code that answered every objection before it could be formed. "The hiding would be the threat," Robin said, his voice dropping into a register that made the secondary aides look up from their slates. "Showing it openly is confidence." Vass didn't smile. She merely adjusted the paper on the desk so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the wood. "We believe in transparency, Counselor. It saves time." Pell cleared his throat from the observation box, his voice coming through the local comm link. "High Counselor, the vessel has initiated an open-channel broadcast. They are beaming their entire internal blueprint, including fuel ratios and maintenance schedules, to every receiver within 3 light years." "Why?" Heth demanded, his small hands clenching into fists against his robes. What is the purpose of this? It is a safety measure, Vass said, her hand moving to her gray hair for a brief second before falling back to her lap. The ship carries 3 internal fabrication bays capable of manufacturing most of her own structural parts from raw asteroid ore. We broadcast the specifications so local salvage crews know which frequencies to avoid if we are processing material in the area. Robin looked at the paper she had placed on the table. The ink was dark, the characters small and precise. He realized then that she hadn't come to argue about boundaries. She had come to show them the new scale of the room. Heth pressed his long, 4-jointed fingers onto his data slate until the plastic casing groaned. We are not here to discuss the historical details of our treaties, Ambassador. We are here because human mining platforms are pulling ore from Sector 12 without a license from the Trade Office. The platforms are automated, Daravass said, her voice remaining low and steady. They do not require licenses because they operate outside the jurisdiction of your customs house. If you look at the coordinate log on page 3 of our response, you will find that the collection points sit exactly 41 meters beyond the old treaty line. Robin felt a dull ache behind his eyes. He looked at the sheet of paper she had brought. It was cheap, thin material, yet it carried a weight that the digital systems in the room could not balance. He knew what Heth was trying to do. The Mercantile Syndicate wanted to force a delay, to freeze the human machinery through a long legal review while their own freight haulers cleared the nearby fields. It was an old tactic that usually worked against younger, less established civilizations. 41 meters is an administrative margin, Heth snapped, his carapace shifting to a dull brick red. A simple calculation error. Human navigation arrays do not make calculation errors, Vass replied. She did not raise her voice, but her words fell into the chamber like iron weights. Every platform is locked to the local pulsar grid. They are exactly where we intended them to be. The silence returned, heavier this time. Robin leaned back, his slate-colored skin cold against his linen shirt. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the station's main generator through the floorboards. The power grid was struggling to handle the static charge coming off the human ship parked 200 kilometers away. It wasn't an attack. It was simply the mass of the vessel pulling at the station's old stabilization fields. "Let us speak plainly," Robin said, his deep voice cutting through the rising murmur of the lower desk aides. "The Directorate cannot allow an unmonitored industry to grow on our border. It creates an instability that our current framework cannot support." "The instability is not our industry, Counselor," Vass said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an ordinary silver stylus, turning it slowly between her fingers. "The instability is your belief that you can regulate things you cannot see or stop." Heth stood up, his short legs kicking his chair back against the stone floor. "This is an ultimatum. You are threatening the Council with a single warship." "It is not a warship," Vass said, her expression perfectly calm as she looked up at the Syndicate representative. "The Enduring Resolve is a strategic logistics platform. She carries no offensive missiles. Her hull contains only manufacturing equipment, fuel stores, and engineering crews. A ship of that mass does not need missiles to destroy a station." Pell's voice broke through the intercom from the sensor deck, his tone uncharacteristically thin. "High Counselor, the human vessel has just changed its output profile. They aren't broadcasting blueprints anymore." Robin shifted his gaze to his terminal. The 41-line manifest had disappeared. In its place, a single line of fresh data was loading, repeating every 3 seconds. It wasn't an engineering log. It was a live countdown timer, synchronized exactly to the station's master clock. "What is that?" Heth asked, his hand twitching toward his ceremonial staff. "What are they counting down to?" "Our next shift change," Vass said. She laid the silver stylus down on the mahogany table with a soft click. "The automated platforms will finish their first collection run in 40 minutes. At that time, they will clear their holding bins and begin the second phase of the operation. And if we order our patrol ships to lock those bins, Heth demanded, then our logistics platform will move forward to collect the material directly, Vass said. She did not lean forward. She did not point her finger. She simply sat there, an ordinary human woman in a plain gray suit, dismantling 40 years of bureaucratic leverage with 5 words. The choice is entirely yours. Robin looked down at his terminal, watching the seconds drop away. The numbers were bright green, steady, and completely indifferent to the laws of the 11-fold directorate. He looked back at Vass, trying to find a crack in her polite exterior, some sign of anger or hesitation that he could use to turn the negotiation. There was nothing. She had brought a mountain into their parlor, and she was waiting to see if they would try to move it. "We will recess for 20 minutes, Robin announced, his voice flat. He did not wait for Heth to object or for the other delegates to check their slates. He stood up, his heavy robes rustling in the dry air, and walked toward the private side chamber. The side room was small, smelling of old paper, and the bitter herbal tea that Robin drank to keep his stomach settled. He did not pour a cup today. He stood by the small glass observation port that looked out toward the empty sector coordinates. 200 kilometers away, the silhouette of the human vessel was visible against the background stars, a vast, dark wedge that seemed to swallow the light around it. Pell entered the room a moment later, his primary optic lens still clouded with dust from his workspace. "The readings are stable, Counselor. The mass isn't changing, but the internal energy signatures are rising. They are drawing power from their main reactor core." "To feed the fabrication bays?" Robin asked. "No," Pell said, his deep blinking pattern accelerating until his eyelid looked like a gray smudge. "They are running a localized gravity sweep. They are checking the structural integrity of Station Meridian's hull plates." Robin turned from the glass, his hands clenching behind his back. "They are measuring our armor." "They are measuring our rust," Pell corrected him, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They know exactly how old our support struts are. They know where the weld lines are cracking in Sector 9. They aren't looking at us as an enemy fleet, sir. They are looking at us as a structural hazard." The door opened again, and Heth slipped into the room, his shell pale. "We have 3 patrol ships within range of the automated platforms. If we fire a warning shot, the legal record will show we defended our sovereign borders first." "The legal record will be written by the survivors, Heth," Robin said, his tone biting. "And right now, your patrol ships are smaller than the individual waste valves on that logistics platform." "We cannot just sign the territory away," Heth hissed. "The Syndicate has already sold the mineral rights for Sector 12 to the Core World refineries. If we back down now, the market will collapse before the next shift." Robin walked back to the observation port, his eyes fixed on the distant wedge of dark metal. He thought about the 40 years he had spent building the rules of this chamber, the thousands of small compromises that had kept the 11 species from destroying each other over boundary lines and trade tax rates. It had been a beautiful system, built on the assumption that everyone had something to lose. But the humans hadn't come to play that game. They hadn't hidden their metrics or tried to make their ships look smaller to avoid a fight. They had shown their entire hand on an open channel because they didn't believe the Directorate had the strength to fold it. "The countdown has reached 10 minutes, Pell reported, his fingers tracing a line on his handheld monitor. "The human ship has just deactivated its forward docking markers. They are clearing the area around their main drive." "Call the chamber back to order," Robin said. He adjusted his collar, the fabric feeling tight against his throat. "And tell the patrol ships to power down their targeting arrays. We are going back to the table." When Robin re-entered the main room, Vass was still sitting exactly where he had left her. She hadn't touched her leather briefcase, and her paper document remained uncreased on the dark wood. The silver stylus lay beside it, pointing toward the center of the table like a compass needle. "Ambassador," Robin said as he took his seat, his voice echoing in the silent room, "the Council has reviewed your coordinates. We find that while the automated platforms are technically outside our active customs zone, their presence creates a conflict with our long-term environmental safety standards. We are willing to share our environmental logs," Vass said, her tone smooth. "Our platforms release nothing but pure nitrogen ice as a byproduct of the core separation process. The local environment will actually be cleaner after our shift ends." Heth sat down slowly, his shell clicking against the bench. He didn't look at Vass. He looked at his screen, where the green numbers were still counting down toward zero. "The refineries require a formal guarantee that the trade lanes will remain unobstructed." "The lanes will be clear," Vass said. "Our logistics platform does not move unless a collection cycle is active, and we always broadcast our flight path 3 days before the drive fires." "3 days," Robin repeated. He leaned forward, his large hands resting on the edge of the mahogany bench. "That is a very narrow window for a ship of that size to alter its course if a civilian convoy enters the grid." "The ship does not alter its course, Counselor," Vass said. Her voice didn't carry any malice, only the cold, unyielding precision of an engineering diagram. "The civilian convoys will have 3 days to alter theirs." The green numbers on Robin's screen hit zero. A low, deep vibration hummed through the floor of Station Meridian, so profound that the bitter tea in Robin's private room began to ripple in its cup. It wasn't the sound of an explosion. It was the sound of a moon-sized mass beginning its slow, unhurried slide into the inner system. The terminal screens across the council chamber did not flicker. They went completely black for 2 seconds before restarting in a red warning mode. The shift in gravity was tiny, but every delegate felt it in the small bones of their inner ears. The human logistics platform had dropped its anchor fields. High Counselor Robin held the edges of the mahogany bench, his slate skin growing tight as the emergency power systems groaned. "They have adjusted their trajectory," Pell said, his voice coming through the deck comm link without its usual administrative protocol. "The vessel isn't passing the station. It is matching our exact orbital velocity. They are staying." Robin looked across the room at Dara Vass. She had not reached for her briefcase, nor had she looked at the warning screens. She sat with her hands loose in her lap, watching the red lights paint the chamber walls with a cold, steady rhythm. "The movement is a standard alignment," Vass said, her voice cutting through the sudden panic of the lower desk aides. "When our platforms begin their second run, the main ship must act as a terminal hub for the raw ore. If we remain outside your active grid, the data delay slows our refining cycles by 3 minutes. 3 minutes, Heth whispered, his red carapace turning a dark, bruised purple. "You shook an entire sector hub for 3 minutes of production time." "Efficiency is an administrative requirement," Vass said. Robin leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the wood. The personal stake of this boundary dispute had vanished. The relational trust between the 11 species was fracturing as Heth's aides began whispering into their private comm units. The true threat wasn't kinetic violence. It was the complete lack of malice in the human method. They were rearranging the local space geography with the casual indifference of a clerk moving a filing cabinet. "We have 30 patrol vessels in the adjacent sector," Heth said, his voice rising as he turned toward the other delegates. "If we pool our local defense reserves, we can establish a kinetic blockade around the automated platforms before their next shift begins." "The blockade would be ineffective," Pell's voice interrupted from the terminal speaker. "The sensor deck has just processed the lower tiers of the human manifest. Counselor, the ship isn't built from armor plate." Robin frowned, his large eyes blinking slowly. "Explain." "The hull is an open-frame grid," Pell said, the sound of his fingers tapping frantic diagnostics audible over the line. It has no single point of failure. If you fire a kinetic slug through the main body, it passes through empty cargo space or modular fabrication bays. To stop the ship, you would have to reduce 4 kilometers of open steel to dust. Our patrol vessels do not carry that volume of ordnance. Vass picked up her printed document, the paper crisp against her fingers. The design is open source. We found that solid hulls create unnecessary thermal mass during atmospheric entry. It is much simpler to let the vacuum pass through the structure. Robin felt the cold realization sink deeper into his chest. This was the second level of their mistake. They had treated humanity as an empire that hid its secrets, a rival state that could be managed with treaties and defensive geometry. But you could not build a wall against an entity that gave you its blueprints and waited for you to do the math. "There is an amendment," a new voice said. Robin turned his head. It was the delegate from the third sector, a quiet, multi-limbed representative who had not spoken during the entire 11 days of the session. He had spent the morning staring at the looping data rows on his small desk monitor, his long fingers typing silent queries into the station's historical archive. "The Project Titan manifest contains a footnote," the quiet delegate said, his voice thin but clear in the sudden silence of the room. The file was not classified by a military council. It was locked by an automated census office because the population metrics did not match the core registries. Robin looked down at his terminal as the quiet delegate forwarded the data. The file showed the deployment numbers for the engineering crews inside the Enduring Resolve. It listed 11,000 souls, but beneath that number, the system had highlighted a separate baseline. The ship's internal foundries were currently printing the structural ribs for a second platform. The construction had started 7 days ago, using the raw asteroid dust cleared from the outer belt. "They aren't just mining," Robin said, his voice dropping into a flat whisper. "We are expanding our logistics web," Vass said, her tone remaining completely courteous. "The second platform will be completed within the month. It will require its own alignment coordinates, which we will provide to your customs office 3 days before its drive fires." Heth sank back into his seat, his hand dropping away from his ceremonial staff. The open loop had just widened until it swallowed the entire sector. The Directorate had spent a century regulating the scarcity of ore, controlling the growth of small species by measuring their fuel allotments and their shipyard permits. Now, a civilization had arrived that grew its ships in the mud of dead rocks, broadcasting the recipe to anyone who cared to listen. "This is a violation of the regional balance," Heth said, though the anger had left his voice, replaced by a hollow, mechanical compliance. "The market cannot absorb 2 platforms of that mass." "The market is not our concern, Counselor," Vass said. She set the printed paper back down, her fingers aligning it once more with the silver stylus. "Our concern is the coming winter." Robin looked at her gray-streaked hair, the unadorned wool suit, the bronze crest that had grown dark with oxidation. "The winter." "The sector registries show a cyclic drop in solar radiation across the outer rim every 40 years, Vass said, her voice steady and flat, like an accountant reading a ledger. "Your tribunals have documented the fuel shortages in the lower sectors for 3 generations. You handled the problem by reducing the citizen allotments in the mining zones." She paused, her eyes locking onto Robin's slate-colored face. "We do not reduce allotments," she said. Robin looked back at his terminal, where the live clock was now counting upward from 0, tracking the seconds of the new human shift. He realized then that the file hadn't predicted the human ships. It had predicted the Directorate's inability to understand them. They were looking at an architecture of absolute confidence, built by a species that responded to a territorial threat by offering to heat the rooms of their neighbors. "The Joint Commission," Robin said, his voice steadying as he reached for his own stylus. "We will skip the legal review. The Council will accept the coordinate logs for Sector 12 as written." Heth did not object. The other delegates remained silent, their terminals glowing red in the dim air of the chamber. Pell's voice came through the intercom one last time, his tone hushed. "High Counselor, the secondary ship has just laid its keel core. The gravitational reading has doubled." The second keel did not create a new alarm. It simply sat on the station's grid like an anchor dropping into deep mud. The red lines on the terminal screens went flat. High Counselor Robin did not look at his boards anymore. He kept his large, dark eyes on the silver stylus that Ambassador Dara Vass had left resting on the dark mahogany table. "We require 3 days to update the customs routing," Robin said, his voice dropping into the quiet register of a clerk filing a routine tax ledger. "The automated platforms must hold their collection cycles until the new boundary markers are certified by the regional office." "The platforms cannot hold," Vass said. She reached into her briefcase, her fingers finding a small linen handkerchief. She used it to wipe a single droplet of condensed water from the silver barrel of her stylus before setting the fabric back down. It was a dull, ordinary motion. "The machinery runs on a continuous fuel cycle. If we stop the extraction plates now, the thermal load requires 20 days of cooling before the internal foundries can restart." Heth did not scream this time. He sat with his hands folded inside his heavy velvet sleeves, his shell a cold, faded gray. He looked at the printed paper she had brought. The thin white sheet was the only unnetworked object in the room, a physical record that could not be hacked, jammed, or turned off by a station power surge. He realized why she had carried it. It wasn't an archaic habit. It was an absolute guarantee of presence. A digital slate could be erased with a localized pulse, but a printed manifest had to be looked at. "The Directorate will waive the certification window," Robin announced. He did not ask for a vote from the 11 delegates. He did not look at the empty chairs where the security staff usually stood. He simply drew his own signature across the digital margin of the treaty screen. "The coordinates for Sector 12 are approved as a permanent free transit corridor." Vass picked up her silver stylus, her gray hair catching the dim red glow of the overhead emergency lights as she leaned back. "Thank you, High Counselor. Our engineers will begin the local distribution network at the start of the next watch." "Distribution?" Heth asked, his voice a thin rattle. "The excess thermal output from our refinement loops must be discharged," Vass said, her tone remaining completely courteous as she zipped her thin leather briefcase. "We have adjusted our alignment so the heat vents face your lower housing tiers. Your engineering teams will find the connection nodes already active on level 9. Robin did not answer. He watched her stand, her matte gray wool suit uncreased after 11 days of administrative paralysis. She did not offer a formal salute, nor did she wait for the chamber doors to chime. She walked out of the room with the same quiet efficiency she had used to enter it, leaving the curved mahogany table entirely clear. The private recess room smelled of old dust and the cold herbal tea Robin had left behind 40 minutes ago. He stood by the glass observation port, his long digits pressing against the cold pane. 200 kilometers away, the dark silhouette of the enduring Resolve was no longer a single wedge. A second frame was rising from its underbelly, a clean grid of raw iron ribs that caught the light of the distant sun. "The patrol ships have confirmed the signature," Pell's voice came through the desk monitor, flat and hollow. "The second keel is an identical match. It carries the same manufacturing capacity." Robin looked at the highlighted numbers from the public archive on his slate. 11,000 engineers lived inside that first metal hull. He looked past the statistics, down to the logistics roster for the fabrication decks, where a single name was logged under the shift supervisor list. Marcus Vass, age 41, welder first class. He was the ambassador's brother, listed on an open-source registry that anyone in the galaxy could read for 3 credits. He had been working the low-tier framing bays for 7 years, moving pieces of standard iron pipe from a machine to a crane, while his sister sat in a velvet room on Station Meridian. The scale of the empire didn't live in a council ledger. It lived in a family box. "They are not going back," Robin said, his voice dropping below the hum of the air scrubbers. "No," Pell whispered from his deck. "The manifest says they brought enough seed material for 40 more hulls. They are building the city here." The civilian staff on Level 9 had already gathered at the main viewports when the human logistics ship began its final alignment change. They did not speak. They watched the massive blue-white drive system power up over 4 long minutes, the exhaust columns shifting from a sharp violet to a dull, heavy gold as the platform settled into its permanent grid coordinates. The station air smelled exactly the same as it had for 40 years, recycled nitrogen, iron dust, and the stale grease of old cargo lifts. But every engineer on the watch walked with their head turned toward the empty space where the boundary markers used to sit. "Was it a declaration?" Heth asked, his shadow falling across the dark wood of the curved bench as he came to stand beside Robin's chair. Robin turned from the glass, his heavy robes rustling against the metal deck plates. He looked down at the empty table where the printed sheet had been. The paper was gone, but the impression of the silver stylus remained in the soft varnish of the mahogany, a thin, straight line pointing directly toward the outer rim. "No warning," Robin said. "No declaration, no mercy." "Then what was it?" "The context," Robin said. He adjusted his collar, his fingers cold against his slate skin. "The context itself is the message, and we have to live in it." The vessel behaved with complete professionalism throughout its deployment. The final log entry on Robin's terminal populated the screen without an error code, the bright green text flat and absolute against the black interface. "Recommend updating our classification standards for the outer belt." The station's secondary communications deck remained quiet through the night watch. The open-source manifest continued its 41-line loop on the outer frequencies, broadcasting its kinetic limits and its raw material tolerances to the empty stars. The text did not change its pitch. The transmission did not compress its data rows. It simply repeated its metrics every 3 seconds, steady and unhurried, while the new iron ribs of the second keel cooled in the dark.